In the previous module, we focused on revenues, and with this module, we will focus on the expenditures. Let's now talk about how budgets are formatted. We'll also then focus on the advantages and disadvantages of the different budget formats. Expenditures are the key element in budgeting, and this is particularly true given that budgeting focuses on answering the basic fundamental question of how do we allocate funds for activities X versus activity Y? So policymakers and decision makers can use two types of information to answer this question. The first is program information. This is basically data on what government does and what those activities need to accomplish. The second type of information has to do with the resource information, the inputs necessary to perform those government activities. So, for example, what you're actually spending the money on in terms of personnel, facilities, equipment, supplies. Both types of information must be considered in combination in the process of allocating resources. The ideal goal is to have a budget that relates the activities and accomplishments of government to the resources that are available. So as we discussed in the earlier modules, the budgetary process is a tool or a vehicle for planning. So budget preparation should be based not only on resource information, but should also incorporate program data for it to be useful for planning purposes. There are several different budget expenditure formats, and these formats establish the rules by which the budget game is played and essentially are the decision rules. In addition, these budget expenditure formats create the standards by which success is measured because they provide the rules of evidence to gauge that success. The budget format refers to the way that the information is structured, the kinds of information that's required to justify the budget requests, and the kind of questions that are asked during the budget review process. We will focus on 5 different formats: the lump sum budget, the line item or objects of expenditure budget, the performance budget, program budget, and zero-based budget. Lump sum budgeting is the simplest approach to budgeting. This approach categorizes spending in total for each category of expenditure. It specifies very broad spending limits and focuses on general accountability with much more discretion in the implementation of the budget. Some of the advantages of lump sum budgeting include it being a simple process, that it's very easily understood, and that it allows for flexibility and discretion. Those same advantages, however, can lead to disadvantages. Because of the simplicity of the lump sum budget, there's very little information for oversight. There's a lack of attention to detail because of the very broad, bigger picture nature of the lump sum budget, and discretion might come at a cost. And so the disadvantage of lump sum budgeting could also be that there may be too much discretion in implementation. The line item or objects of expenditure budget takes the lump sum budget one step beyond and involves more detailed object codes for specific classes or categories of expenditures. This line item budget is characterized by a list of what the money will be spent on, such as travel, personnel, supplies. The original purpose of the line item budget was to promote financial accountability beyond what was available through lump sum budgeting, because through line item or objects of expenditure budgeting, money can be more easily tracked from the point of appropriation to the point of expenditure. It therefore allows for better control by specifying what can and cannot be purchased. So for example, resources that are categorized for travel cannot then be used to pay for expenditures related to personnel issues. The line item or objects of expenditure budget is by far the most durable and commonly used budget format, And while there have been more recent developments and advancements in budgeting, the line item budget is almost always superimposed or used alongside these other more advanced budget formats. So let's talk about some of the advantages of the line item budget. One of the advantages is that because a lot of the decision making takes place at the margin, the process is efficient and involves minimal complexity. It reduces a lot of conflict. The focus on financial accountability makes it more difficult for money intended to build a bridge, for example, to be used to build a community center or to make other types of projects. On the other hand, the disadvantage is that the line item budget does not address the issues of efficiency, effectiveness, of policy priorities and programming priorities that are important to governments. Performance budgeting is a budget format that takes the line item or objects of expenditure budget a step further and incorporates the measurement of results in the allocation of budget resources. So, the use of performance budgeting also incorporates questions about what's being done by government and what the associated costs are. Performance budgeting includes the line item or objects of expenditure budget and supplements that with information on performance, including information about effectiveness, efficiency, and even workload. The primary issue with performance budgeting is that measuring performance is a challenge. And subsequently, what a lot of governmental agencies have done is to focus instead of on performance, focusing on outputs rather than the outcomes that are more relevant to the incorporation of performance into budgeting. Some of the advantages of performance budgeting, first and foremost, is that it offers insight into the likely effects of budgetary change on the performance of the governmental entity, and also that it may encourage efforts to improve productivity in terms of efficiency or effectiveness and workload. But there's also the downside in that because there's now the incorporation of performance information, there's a lot more work that's involved in making budgeting decisions. But performance may also generate additional conflict, not only about what agencies should be doing, but also in terms of measuring the performance of what those agencies are doing. The focus on activities of the performance budgeting may also be a drawback in a sense because the focus is on what's being done, not on whether those activities are necessarily accomplishing the important goals. Program budgeting takes performance budgeting a step further and really kind of came about through planning, programming, and the budgeting system or PPBS of the 1960s. And here, program is defined as a systematic set of activities designed to accomplish one or more goals or outcomes. And through program budgeting, beyond just asking what resources we're going to be expending, we're also answering questions about program purpose, goals, and outcomes that move beyond just what should the program be doing and achieving. One of the issues with program budgeting is that it's very analysis oriented, involves cost analysis, involves activity analysis, and even forecasting techniques. And some of the elements, the program elements that have been incorporated into budgeting practices through program budgeting include information about program impact and accomplishments, includes having an emphasis more on goals, and an emphasis on the effects of budgetary decisions on future years. In terms of advantages, one of the key advantages of program budgeting is that it allows for a more purposeful allocation of resources and provides for a more visible and concrete expression to citizens of how their tax dollars are being spent. So now not only can we say we're spending X dollars, but we're also saying we're spending X dollars to do A, B, C, and D and to achieve X, Y, and Z. The downside or the disadvantages is that there's because it's a much more rigid focus on what should be done in terms of purpose, goals, and outcomes, there's a limited flexibility to shift dollars from one program to another or to respond to issues or problems that might arise. Program budgeting is also difficult and it's also expensive because it's very analysis oriented, and also it's very high conflict because now not only do we need to come to agreement about resource allocation, we also need to come to agreement about programming and about the purposes, goals, and outcomes of these programming. In terms of program budgeting, there are 5 basic steps: the mission statement, having goals and objectives, determining the activities undertaken to achieve objectives, and then kind of having a summary integration of activities into a program. The mission involves a statement of the general purpose of the organization that then translates into a goal, which is a statement of purpose directed towards an identified community need. From the goal, we then have objectives, which are the desired results in which the achievement is measurable over a given time frame. The activities are the specific and distinguished units of work that are performed by the organization to accomplish the specific objectives. And then the program then links and ties all of the related activities and projects to accomplish the specific objective or goal. Some of the key elements of program budgeting are that it introduces planned spending for future years. It organizes the budgets by programs or activities that work together to achieve the same objective, but also involves analysis of impact of the activities on the government goals and allows for thinking about alternative funding strategies for achieving those goals. Another way of budgeting involves what if budgeting, and zero based budgeting is the most well known approach to what if or scenario budgeting. Zero based budgeting, or ZBB, was intended to introduce a more systematic planning and analytic perspective into resource allocation. Basically, what it does, it eliminates the incremental assumption, and budget requests must start from zero, and budgeteers must justify every incremental dollar. The resource allocation decision begins with decision units that are then compiled into decision packages that allow for the prioritization of decision packages given certain amounts of resources. So the budgeteers build the decision units and then the decision packages to then link that to likely levels of performance given different funding levels. The advantage or the beauty of zero-based budgeting is that it answers questions about what choices are offered, and then given what's offered, what choices are preferred. So this is where the what if or the scenario analysis comes into play. And therefore, ZBB provides information on consequences of funding or not funding a specific decision package. If we think about it from the perspective of advantages versus disadvantages, the advantages is that developing the decision units and developing the decision packages involves frontline and street level bureaucrats in the decision making, but it also then forces a more planning oriented approach to thinking about resource allocation. And because it eliminates the incremental assumption and forces justification of every dollar spent, it forces the re examination of why programs and activities are being funded in lieu of other possibilities or other programs. But all of this then leads to kind of the disadvantage. The key disadvantage of zero-based budgeting is that it's very complicated because you have to start from zero every time, because you have to build decision units and decision packages and then prioritize these decision packages. ZBB is complicated, it's very information intensive. The overall process is more complex, it's more time consuming, and it's very costly, but also it introduces it introduces a lot more opportunities for conflict. Given the complexity of zero-based budgeting, some governmental agencies have moved towards modified zero-based budgeting that takes advantage of the what if or scenario analysis approach of ZBB. And basically, what happens is it uses a current level of spending and then incorporates one or more alternative budgets. So, for example, budgeteers might put together a current level of spending, an alternative that involves 5% spending increase, an alternative that involves 5% spending decrease, and another alternative that involves a 10% spending decrease. There are three key elements to modify ZBB. The first is the base budget, which is basically defined as the expenditure level necessary to maintain last year's service level at next year's prices. But then the reduced level budgets are the percentages 5% increase, 5% decrease, 10% decrease that the budget is required to be reduced below or above that base budget. So this reduced level budget typically includes services that are considered critical or essential, but may also include new or existing programs. The final element of that modified ZBB approach is basically the decision packages, which are discrete additions to the reduced level budget that are then ranked in priority to maintain existing programs, to serve increased workloads, or to add new programs, but can be incrementally added on in order of priority.